What if I told you that one of the Queen's most trusted children, Princess Anne, stumbled upon something so explosive it could not only fracture the House of Windsor forever, but exile Prince Harry from his birthright once and for all? Think about it. We've seen the royal family endure scandals, heartbreaks, and betrayals across centuries, abdications, affairs, power struggles, but rarely has there been an accusation of outright conspiracy against the very crown itself. Yet, here we are, staring down a story that feels more like a Shakespearean tragedy than real life. A son of the monarchy, a woman who married into it, and a scheme that could shake the throne to its core. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's not dance around it. The allegation is simple but devastating. Prince Harry, the once beloved spare, and Meghan Markle, the outsider who turned the monarchy upside down, are accused of conspiring to blackmail the crown itself. And the person who dragged this secret into the light? None other than Princess Anne, the famously no-nonsense daughter of Queen Elizabeth, a woman who has been called the royal family's steel spine. But how did Anne discover such a thing? And why, after years of family fractures and reconciliation attempts, would she choose this moment to reveal it? That's the question we're about to untangle. Stay with me, because this isn't just about a feud. It's about the survival of the monarchy itself. Imagine the scene for a moment. A quiet corridor in Buckingham Palace, the smell of old paper and polished wood hanging in the air, and, dignified yet restless, sorting through documents left behind after the Queen's death. A sealed envelope, tucked where it shouldn't have been, catches her eye. The handwriting, familiar. The seal, unmistakable. Something in her gut tells her this is not just another royal memorandum. She opens it. The words she reads pull the breath from her lungs. At that moment, and realizes she is holding not just paper, but dynamite, evidence of betrayal by her very own nephew. That's where our story begins. Why does this matter now, you might ask? Because the crown is at a fragile crossroads. King Charles's reign is still new. William is preparing to step into a role that could define him for the rest of his life, and public trust in the monarchy has already been shaken by scandal after scandal. Add in the global spotlight on Harry and Meghan since Megxit, their explosive interviews, and their billion-dollar Hollywood ventures, and suddenly, whispers of conspiracy are not just gossip, they're survival-level threats. If Anne's discovery proves true, this isn't just another family drama. It's a potential act of treason, a direct strike at the very foundation of the royal institution. But let's pause here and ask a harder question. Could it be true? Could Harry, who walked behind Diana's coffin as a grieving boy, who once symbolized the modern, relatable future of the monarchy, really turn against his family with such venom? And if so, what pushed him there? Was it Meghan's influence? Was it his own resentment at a lifetime lived in the shadow of his brother? Or was it something darker, something premeditated, something planned? These aren't easy questions, and they deserve to be examined, layer by layer. That's what this exposé will do. The introduction to this saga has to do more than just shock. It must remind us of the stakes. Think about history. Remember Edward VIII, who abdicated in 1936 for love. That single act rippled across decades, reshaping the monarchy forever. If Harry really conspired to blackmail his own family, we're not talking about abdication. We're talking about sabotage, treachery, a betrayal so deep it makes Edward's choice look like child's play. And here's the chilling part. Princess Anne allegedly has the receipts, letters, recordings, proof that Harry and Meghan weren't just critics of the institution, they were plotting its downfall from within. Let that sink in. Now, some of you may wonder, why would Anne, of all people, bring this to light? Isn't she known for keeping her head down, for serving the crown without fuss or drama? That's precisely what makes her revelation so compelling, and has no reputation for theatrics, no history of attention-seeking. She is duty personified. For her to step forward, she must have been convinced that the monarchy itself was in danger. And when you hear what she discovered, you'll understand why she had no choice but to act. But before we get to the evidence, let's talk about Harry's journey. Because to understand this alleged betrayal, we have to understand the man himself. Once the cheeky prince adored for his charm and military service, Harry transformed in the public eye. From party prince to hero in uniform to exiled duke, His story has always been about reinvention. But reinvention can sometimes cross into rebellion. And rebellion, unchecked, can turn into something far more destructive. Was his move to California a fresh start? Or was it the first step in a larger scheme? And Meghan, how does she fit into this puzzle? To her supporters, she's the bold, outspoken woman who challenged centuries of archaic royal tradition. To her critics, she's the manipulative actress who played the role of a duchess until it no longer suited her. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but if Anne's revelations are accurate, Meghan wasn't just influencing Harry. She was allegedly co-architect of a plot. Blackmail, after all, isn't about words spoken in frustration. It's about leverage, power, and intent. And according to these allegations, Meghan and Harry believe they had all three. Here's where I want to pull you, the audience, into this. Ask yourself, if you were sitting in Anne's place, holding those damning letters, hearing those chilling recordings, what would you do? Would you stay silent to protect family unity? Or would you risk tearing the family apart to protect the institution of the crown? It's a moral dilemma, and Anne's decision reveals everything about her character. She chose loyalty to the monarchy over loyalty to her nephew. And in doing so, she may have sealed Harry's fate. We're only scratching the surface here. Because as dramatic as this sounds, the real storm lies in the details of what and uncovered. Letters that hint at coordination between Harry and Meghan to exploit royal secrets. Recordings that allegedly capture them discussing ways to control the narrative. Think about the implications. The monarchy thrives on mystique, tradition, and public trust. If that mystique is weaponized from within, what's left? A crumbling house of cards. That's why this story isn't just scandal, it's existential. And yet, there's an irony that cannot be ignored. Harry has often accused the crown of silencing him, of using the press to control narratives against him. But now, it's Harry who stands accused of silencing the monarchy with threats of exposure. Betrayal often mirrors itself, doesn't it? And betrayal within families cuts the deepest. This isn't a war between strangers. This is brother against brother, son against father, nephew against aunt. Shakespeare couldn't have written it better. So where does that leave us? Right on the edge of revelation. You've heard the whispers of betrayal. You've felt the weight of history pressing down. You've glimpsed the stakes, trust, power, survival. But you haven't yet heard the details. You haven't yet seen what and saw, heard what and heard, or understood why she felt she had no choice but to expose it all. That's where we're heading next. And I promise you, the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Because what Princess and uncovered wasn't just gossip. It wasn't just family drama. It was the kind of evidence that could exile a prince, divide a nation, and shatter the legacy of a queen. And yet, it was only the beginning. The letters were damning, yes. The recordings were shocking, absolutely. But there was one phrase, one chilling line, buried deep within that evidence, that turned this scandal into a nightmare. And that's what we'll uncover when we step into the next chapter. What would you do if you opened a letter and found your own nephew's name staring back at you in a context so dark it made your blood run cold? That was the exact moment Princess Anne realized she had stumbled onto something no one was supposed to see. She wasn't looking for it. She wasn't digging for dirt. She was simply sifting through documents, tidying up loose ends after her mother's passing, when her hands landed on an envelope that carried far more than ink and paper. It carried betrayal. The handwriting was unmistakable, not Harry's but addressed to him. The seal bore a mark that suggested discretion, a seal meant to keep prying eyes away. But Anne, known for her pragmatism and her loyalty to the institution, felt a chill crawl up her spine as though some inner voice whispered, "You need to see this." She broke the seal, and what she found inside would mark the beginning of the most disturbing revelation the royal family has faced in decades. The words on the page weren't harmless musings or affectionate family chatter. No, these words carried weight, intention, and a dangerous kind of power. They spoke of strategy. They hinted at leverage. They outlined a tone of manipulation and control. And above all else, they carried Harry's name, entwined with Meghan's, in a way that made it crystal clear they were partners in more than just marriage. They were allegedly partners in a plan. Now pause for a moment. Ask yourself this. If you discovered that two of the most polarizing figures in modern royal history had been quietly orchestrating a campaign to hold the monarchy hostage with its own secrets, would you believe it? Or would you dismiss it as too sensational, too far-fetched to be real? That was Anne's dilemma. Yet as she read line after line, the incredulity melted away and was replaced by dread. This was not vague suggestion. It was direct, explicit, intentional. The letter spoke of options and timing. It alluded to information that cannot be ignored. Phrases that seemed innocuous enough on their own but, when pieced together, read like a roadmap to extortion. Anne's heart sank. She had always known Harry was restless, that Meghan had a sharp, calculating edge, but this was treachery. She could feel her pulse quicken, her mind racing ahead to what this could mean. If true, it wasn't just a scandal. It was a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the monarchy. And here's the contradiction that makes this story even more gut-wrenching. Harry has always portrayed himself as the victim of the royal machine. He's spoken endlessly about how the crown controlled him, how the press was used against him, how he longed to break free from the suffocating grip of duty. And yet here, on these pages, was evidence that he had allegedly chosen to do the very thing he accused his family of, using information as a weapon, controlling narratives, threatening silence for gain. Isn't that the very definition of irony? The victim becoming the aggressor? And read on. There were references to meetings, to discussions far from the ears of the palace. Mentions of allies outside the family who could be trusted to move things forward when the time was right. If you've ever seen a chess game unfold, you know the most dangerous moves aren't the ones made in haste, but the ones carefully planned 10 steps ahead. That's what this looked like, a slow, deliberate game of chess, with the crown as the opponent, and Harry and Meghan playing blackmail as their queen piece. But let's not romanticize it. Blackmail isn't clever. It isn't noble. It's ugly. It's an act born of desperation and greed. And that's what made Anne's stomach turn. She had devoted her entire life to upholding the crown's dignity, sacrificing personal freedom for duty. And now she was reading the words of a nephew who seemed willing to tear all of that down for leverage, for power, maybe even for revenge. Here's the emotional beat I don't want you to miss. Imagine Anne's position. She's not just a royal. She's a sister. She's a daughter. She's an aunt. This wasn't just an institution being threatened. It was her family, her blood, her late mother's legacy. Every instinct in her told her to protect, to shield, to preserve. And yet, how could she ignore what she had just read? How could she tuck this letter back into its envelope and pretend it didn't exist? That would be complicity. And Anne, for all her flaws, has never been complicit in wrongdoing. Now think of this from Harry's perspective for a moment. If he truly wrote or received such words, what was his state of mind? Did he feel cornered by the crown, convinced that the only way to secure freedom was through threat? Or did Meghan plant the seeds of the idea, appealing to his resentment and pushing him toward betrayal? That's the haunting question we have to grapple with. Was Harry the architect or the accomplice? The letter was only the first piece. And as Anne tucked it into her jacket, heart pounding, she knew it was only the beginning of a trail that could lead to something far worse. Letters are dangerous enough, but what about recordings? Proof that can't be denied, can't be explained away as a misunderstanding? That thought alone was enough to make her hands shake. This wasn't just a nephew's name on paper. It was a door swinging open, revealing a hidden corridor of lies, leverage, and calculated betrayal. And Anne knew she couldn't shut that door now that she had stepped through it. Because as chilling as those words were, the letters were only the beginning. The real evidence wasn't silent, it spoke. And when Anne finally pressed play on the recordings tied to those letters, she realized the betrayal went deeper than ink on paper. And that's where everything changed. What's more chilling than reading a letter that hints at betrayal? Hearing the betrayal spoken aloud in the voices of the very people you trusted most. That was the reality Princess Anne faced when, after uncovering those damning letters, she discovered there were recordings, hours of them, captured in secret, preserved like evidence waiting for the right pair of ears. And when she pressed play, the voices that spilled into the room belonged unmistakably to Harry and Meghan. No more speculation, no more ambiguity. Their own words filled the air, and with them, the undeniable sound of conspiracy. Picture it. A quiet room in the palace. and seated with the recordings cued, the only light coming from a single desk lamp. The moment Harry's voice crackled through the speakers, her chest tightened. It wasn't just that she recognized his voice. It was that the tone was unrecognizable. This wasn't the jovial, cheeky Harry the public adored, nor the vulnerable soldier who spoke so passionately about mental health. This was a colder Harry, calculated, intentional. And Meghan's voice? Calm, sharp, almost rehearsed, like every word had been placed for maximum impact. The first snippet was brief, but devastating. Meghan's voice carried the weight of strategy as she said, "They'll never see it coming. We hold the secrets, Harry. If they push us too far, we'll release them." Harry's reply? A pause, then a low agreement. Yes, that's the only way they'll listen. Now stop and ask yourself, what would you feel if you were, and at that moment? Anger? Fear? Grief? She felt all of it at once. To hear her nephew, Diana's son, agreeing to weaponize family secrets, it was more than betrayal. It was treason of the heart. The recordings weren't a single conversation. They were fragments, pieces of discussions stitched together like a mosaic of disloyalty. Some were late-night talks, Harry's voice weary but resolute. Others were Meghan's monologues, filled with conviction, almost like pep talks designed to keep Harry aligned with the plan. And the content? References to scandals buried in the archives, to whispers about affairs, finances, health struggles, all of it framed as bargaining chips. Let's pause here for a moment. Think about the royal family's entire identity. It thrives on mystique. The less the public knows, the more powerful the institution remains. The monarchy doesn't survive on politics. It survives on perception. So what happens if that mystique is ripped away by its own members? If its darkest secrets are paraded in front of the world not by enemies, but by blood? That's not just betrayal. That's annihilation. And knew the monarchy had weathered storms before. Edward VIII's abdication. Diana's explosive interview with Panorama. Even Harry and Meghan's Oprah sit-down. But those were cracks from the outside. What she heard on those tapes was dynamite planted inside the palace walls. And here's the contradiction that made Anne's hands tremble as she listened. Harry often claimed he wanted freedom from the royal machine. He wanted privacy. Yet here he was, captured on tape, conspiring to trade privacy for power. Isn't that the cruel twist? The very thing he accused the crown of doing, exploiting his pain for gain, was exactly what he seemed prepared to do in return. One recording in particular sent shivers down his spine. Meghan said, "We know what they did to Diana. They'll never want that out. We can use it. It's our strongest card." And Harry didn't argue. He didn't shut her down. Instead, he murmured, "Then we keep it in the vault until it's needed." Imagine hearing that as Diana's sister-in-law. Imagine the flood of memories, the funeral, the loss, the image of two young boys walking behind their mother's coffin. And now, decades later, to hear one of those boys seemingly prepared to use his mother's tragedy as leverage, it wasn't just heartbreaking. It was grotesque. But the recordings went further. They didn't just discuss what they had. They strategized about timing. Meghan mentioned anniversaries, royal tours, global events when attention is highest. Harry suggested, letting leaks drop, just enough to make them nervous. This wasn't idle chatter. It was coordination. Now let's bring you into this moment. If you had heard those words, would you believe the monarchy could survive exposure like that? Would you think King Charles, William, or Anne herself could withstand the blow of personal secrets being twisted into weapons? Or would you agree with Anne that this was not just a family feud, but an existential threat? Anne's mind raced. Every second of those recordings pressed against her sense of loyalty. She thought of her mother, the Queen, who spent 70 years preserving the dignity of the monarchy at all costs. She thought of William, shouldering the weight of being the future king. She thought of the public, still fractured between support for the Sussexes and loyalty to the crown. And in that moment, she knew these recordings couldn't stay hidden. Here's another irony worth noting. Harry often said his greatest fear was history repeating itself. And yet, in these tapes, he seemed ready to ensure history did exactly that. By threatening exposure of Diana's past, by dragging the family's skeletons into the light, he wasn't breaking free of history. He was weaponizing it. But let's not forget Meghan's role in this. Her voice on those recordings wasn't hesitant. It wasn't unsure. It was commanding. She spoke like someone who had rehearsed the script, who believed every word. Some might say she was the strategist, the driver, the one laying out the playbook. But others would argue Harry wasn't some helpless passenger. He was agreeing, nodding, adding his own ideas. Which side do you believe? Was Meghan leading Harry astray? Or was Harry just as complicit? And then came the line. The phrase that turned Anne's stomach, the one that replayed in her mind long after the tape stopped. Meghan's voice, steady, almost chillingly calm. If they want to keep the crown intact, they'll give us what we ask for. Let that sink in. That isn't a plea. That isn't a cry for help. That's blackmail, plain and simple. And hearing Harry's low, quiet agreement sealed it. And realized this wasn't just venting. This wasn't frustration spilling out after years of pain. This was a plot. Her hands shook as she shut off the recorder. The silence that followed was deafening. She could hear her own breathing, heavy, uneven. She knew what she had in her possession was no longer just family drama. It was evidence of treachery. And the question that now clawed at her wasn't whether to act. It was how. Because here's the truth and couldn't escape. If she revealed these recordings, she risked tearing her family apart forever. But if she stayed silent, she risked allowing the monarchy itself to be held hostage. Which betrayal was worse? To expose her nephew, or to betray the crown? That was the impossible choice Anne faced. And as the night wore on, she realized she couldn't make it alone. She would need allies. She would need to bring this to someone who could understand the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. And so, with the recordings tucked safely away and prepared for the next step, she wasn't done. The letters were shocking. The recordings were damning. But the full scope of the plan, the blueprint of betrayal, was yet to be revealed. Because what Anne found next wasn't just words or voices. It was the chilling outline of the blackmail plan itself. What does a blackmail plan against the world's most famous monarchy look like? Is it a vague threat whispered in private, or a meticulously crafted blueprint that lays out each move, each consequence, and each demand? When Princess Anne dug deeper, she found that what she held in her hands wasn't just speculation. It was structure, a framework, a chilling strategy that showed Meghan and Harry weren't simply venting their frustrations. They were allegedly preparing to act. The plan wasn't scrawled in messy handwriting on a single page. It was detailed, layered, and deliberate. Notes, drafts, and outlines that hinted at months of careful thought. Imagine the horror Anne felt as she pieced it together, realizing that this wasn't a couple ranting over dinner. It was a couple plotting leverage like corporate negotiators. And at the center of it all, the monarchy itself was reduced to bargaining chips. Let's start with the first element, information. The plan categorized secrets into tiers, almost like levels of ammunition. Tier 1, minor embarrassments. Unflattering anecdotes about certain royals, internal squabbles, even staff gossip. These were labeled soft releases, information that could be leaked to the press without devastating damage, but enough to create discomfort. Then came Tier 2, sensitive history. References to Diana, to Charles's private struggles, to William's alleged arguments behind palace doors. Information that, if leaked, would erode trust in the monarchy's image. These were described as leverage leaks, not to destroy, but to control. And then, Tier 3, the darkest secrets, financial irregularities, health rumors, affairs whispered but never confirmed. The notes referred to this tier as nuclear. And in the margins of one page, Anne read a line that made her heart stop. Release only if pushed beyond repair. Now, I want you to imagine sitting in Anne's shoes. She's flipping through these documents, reading the cold, calculated language. Words like release, timing, and control. Not the language of family. Not the language of reconciliation. The language of war. Isn't that the ultimate contradiction? Harry, who claimed he wanted peace, was allegedly planning an arsenal of chaos. But the plan didn't stop with categorizing information. It included timelines, notes about when to drop certain stories. One draft suggested anniversaries of Diana's death as key moments for maximum impact. Another marked the Queen's Jubilee as a potential stage. The cynicism of it made Anne's blood boil. These weren't just dates on a calendar, they were sacred family milestones. And here they were, reduced to launchpads for blackmail. And let's not forget the delivery system. The notes referenced trusted journalists, Hollywood allies, even social media strategies. Meghan's alleged handprints were all over this part. She knew how to play the media game, how to control narratives, how to make a story go viral. The plan called for controlled leaks, timed interviews, carefully worded statements that would plant seeds of doubt without exposing the full arsenal. Think about that. Not one giant explosion, but a series of smaller detonations, each one weakening the crown a little more. Now pause and ask yourself, what would be worse? A sudden scandal that everyone rallies around, or a slow bleed of trust that erodes the monarchy over years? That was the genius and the horror of this plan. It wasn't designed to destroy overnight. It was designed to suffocate slowly. And sat back in her chair, her eyes scanning the notes again. And then she saw something that made her heart ache. The word demands. This wasn't just about leverage. It was about what Harry and Meghan allegedly wanted in return for silence. What were those demands? Financial independence guaranteed, security funded indefinitely, public acknowledgement of grievances, and perhaps most disturbing of all, a permanent platform of influence without the responsibilities of royal duty. In plain terms, they wanted the perks without the price. They wanted the crown to bow to them. And the crown, as in new, could never do that. Here's where the contradiction deepens. Harry and Meghan often painted themselves as underdogs, as victims of a powerful institution that never listened. But here, in their alleged plan, they weren't seeking freedom. They were seeking control. Isn't that the ultimate irony? To escape the monarchy's grip, only to turn around and grip the monarchy by the throat. And thought of her mother. Queen Elizabeth had endured crises that would have shattered lesser leaders. She had always believed in quiet dignity, in never complain, never explain. But how could dignity survive in the face of blackmail? How could silence defend against betrayal from within? The Queen's lifelong philosophy suddenly felt like a fragile shield against a storm that was brewing right inside her own family. And let's not overlook the emotional weight. These weren't outsiders threatening the monarchy. These were insiders. Blood, a son of Charles, a brother of William, a nephew of Anne. That made the betrayal cut far deeper. Because betrayal from the outside wounds pride. Betrayal from the inside wounds the soul. Anne's hands trembled as she gathered the documents. She knew what she had wasn't just evidence. It was a ticking time bomb. If these notes were real, and every instinct told her they were, the monarchy was one headline away from implosion. But here's the haunting question for you. What would you do in Anne's place? Do you reveal the plan and risk tearing your family apart publicly? Or do you bury it, pray it never sees the light of day, and live with the knowledge that your nephew may strike at any moment? There's no easy answer. Anne knew it. The plan wasn't theoretical. It wasn't wishful thinking. It was strategy. And the more she studied it, the clearer it became. Meghan and Harry allegedly believed they held the monarchy in the palm of their hands. They thought they could dictate terms. They thought they could bend the crown to their will. But here's the twist. As Anne pieced it together, she realized the plan had one fatal flaw, a crack that neither Harry nor Meghan had considered. A vulnerability that, if exposed, could shatter their entire scheme before it ever had the chance to unfold. And that flaw? That's the revelation that would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when a perfect plan has a single crack in its foundation? Does the entire structure collapse? Or does it wobble just enough to expose the truth? That was the question Princess Anne asked herself as she studied the so-called blackmail blueprint. It was detailed, yes. Ruthless, absolutely. But buried in those notes, she spotted something that Harry and Meghan had overlooked. A flaw, a miscalculation. And it was this very flaw that would eventually turn their alleged plan against them. The flaw wasn't in the information itself. The secrets, if released, could indeed devastate the monarchy. It wasn't in the timing either. Meghan's media instincts were sharp, her understanding of the news cycle almost surgical. No, the flaw lay in something far more human. Something both Harry and Meghan underestimated: loyalty. Here's the irony. For a plan built on betrayal, its success still relied on trust. Trust that certain allies would remain silent. Trust that journalists would protect their sources. Trust that whispered confidences would never leak in the wrong direction. And Anne realized this was their Achilles heel. Because in the world of power, money, and monarchy, loyalty is fragile. Today's confidant is tomorrow's whistleblower. Let's rewind for a moment. Harry and Meghan had allegedly identified a handful of safe conduits, figures in media, Hollywood, even within the palace staff, who they believed could help funnel their narrative. But Anne knew these people weren't bound by blood or crown. They were bound by opportunity. And opportunity, when weighed against royal wrath, could shift in an instant. And here's the contradiction that made the flaw even more glaring. Harry claimed he left the monarchy because he couldn't trust anyone inside it. Yet in building this plan, he placed his trust in outsiders, journalists, agents, media executives. Wasn't that the very same trap Diana fell into, trusting the press that ultimately devoured her story? History wasn't just repeating itself. It was echoing, louder and darker. And saw the evidence. Among the documents were references to assured protection from certain media figures, promises of confidentiality. But there was no contract, no guarantee, just words on a page, dependent on fragile human loyalty. And knew better than anyone. Loyalty in the press is as reliable as sand in a storm. Now picture Anne, sitting at her desk, her mind racing. She understood the magnitude of what she held, but she also understood the crack in the armor. If she could find even one weak link in Harry and Meghan's network, the entire plan could unravel. One leak about the leakers. One betrayal of the betrayers. That was the flaw. But the flaw wasn't just external. It was also internal. Because woven into those recordings, buried between the lines of the letters, was something Anne couldn't ignore: hesitation. At times, Harry's voice wavered. His words carried doubt. Meghan's confidence was unshakable, but Harry's wasn't. And in a conspiracy built for two, doubt is poison. Think about it. Blackmail requires unity. It requires absolute agreement on the strategy, the timing, the stakes. But if even one partner hesitates, the plan teeters. Anne heard it. In one recording, Harry's voice cracked. "Are we sure this is the right way?" Meghan's response was quick, sharp. "It's the only way." That exchange told Anne everything she needed to know. Harry wasn't fully committed. He was conflicted. And that conflict, if exposed, could collapse the entire scheme. Now ask yourself this. Who was really in control? Was Meghan the architect, pushing Harry past his doubts? Or was Harry silently complicit, allowing himself to be carried along by a tide he feared to resist? That's the haunting question. And whichever answer you believe, it reveals the same truth. The plan was never as airtight as it seemed. Anne's discovery of this flaw didn't lessen the danger. The information was still lethal. The threat was still real. But it gave her a sliver of hope. Because if the monarchy could act quickly, strategically, they could exploit the crack before the plan was ever executed. They could expose the exposure. They could turn the narrative against Harry and Meghan before it was too late. But here's where the story takes a darker twist. Because as Anne considered her next move, she realized she wasn't the only one who had spotted the flaw. There were whispers, inside the palace, among trusted aides, that others had already noticed inconsistencies in Harry and Meghan's circle, that someone close to them might already be leaking. And if that was true, the flaw wasn't just a vulnerability. It was a ticking bomb. Imagine the paranoia. Harry and Meghan, thinking they were in control, unaware that their own network might already be compromised. Imagine Anne, holding the evidence, realizing she could use the monarchy's own power of silence and secrecy to turn the tables. The stage wasn't just set for confrontation, it was set for collapse. And here's the emotional punch. For Anne, this wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was grief. Because every time she thought about the flaw, every time she considered using it, she remembered Harry as a boy, laughing, running through Balmoral's halls, holding Diana's hand. She remembered the promise Diana made to protect her sons from the harshest realities of royal life. And now here he was, standing accused of betraying the very crown his mother once symbolized. The flaw didn't erase the pain. It deepened it. But duty is cruel. And Anne's loyalty has always been to the monarchy first. So she knew what she had to do. She had to act. She had to confront. She had to bring the flaw into the light before Harry and Meghan could seal it shut. And that decision, Anne's decision to move forward, would ignite the most explosive confrontation the family had faced since the abdication of Edward VIII. Because the moment she stepped into Harry's world with the evidence in her hand, the battle lines were drawn. The flaw was real. The plan was vulnerable. But Anne's next move would determine whether the monarchy survived, or whether the crown itself would be shattered by the people who once swore to protect it. And when Anne finally walked into that private room, face to face with Harry, the silence was so heavy it could crush stone. She laid the evidence on the table. The letters, the recordings, the notes. And then, with a voice as cold as steel, she asked him the one question no one had dared to ask. Is this who you are now, Harry? And his answer was not denial. What do you say when your own flesh and blood looks you in the eye and demands to know if you've betrayed the family? Denial should be instinctive, rejection immediate. But when Princess Anne placed those letters and recordings before Harry and asked, "Is this who you are now, Harry?" his response was something far more dangerous than a simple no. He didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at her, his face pale but his eyes hard, and said in a low, steady voice, "You wouldn't understand." Imagine that moment. The weight of silence pressing down on the room, thicker than stone. Anne's heart, beating like a drum, waiting for him to laugh it off, to insist it was nonsense. But there was no laughter, no frantic scrambling to explain. Just that line. Cold. Defiant. Now ask yourself, what would you hear in that answer? Guilt? Resentment? Or worse, confirmation? Anne leaned forward, her jaw tight. She wanted to shake him, to remind him of who he was, of the boy who once adored the family he now seemed ready to dismantle. But Harry's posture said it all. He wasn't broken. He wasn't begging. He was resolute. And that terrified her more than any letter or recording ever could. The confrontation wasn't explosive at first. It was quiet, tense. Harry sat, hands clenched, while Anne laid out everything she'd discovered. I've read the letters. I've heard the tapes. I know the plan. Tell me it isn't true. And here came the contradiction that would twist the knife deeper. Harry didn't deny the existence of the recordings. He didn't dispute the words that had been captured, but he tried to reframe them. You don't understand what it's like, he said. To be silenced. To be pushed aside. To watch the same institution that destroyed Mum turn on me and my family. And felt her chest tighten. Because part of her understood. She had lived through Diana's death. She had seen the monarchy mishandle tragedy. But this wasn't grief. It wasn't trauma. It was strategy. And knew the difference. She pressed harder. You were planning to use Diana's memory as a weapon against your own father. Against William. Against the monarchy. Do you even realize what that means? What it does to us? Harry's reply was ice cold. Maybe now they'll listen. Maybe now they'll finally understand what they've done. Pause here and let that sink in. Harry wasn't denying treachery. He was justifying it. To him, betrayal wasn't betrayal, it was payback. And that's what made Anne's blood run cold. But here's the twist. Even as Harry's words echoed with anger, Anne could still hear the cracks in his voice. The hesitation. The conflict. Part of him seemed convinced he was right. But another part, the boy she remembered, sounded like he was drowning. She leaned closer. You think Meghan saved you. But she's leading you down a path you can't come back from. Once you cross this line, Harry, you're not family anymore. You're an enemy. That line hit hard. For a moment, Harry's mask slipped. His shoulders sagged, his eyes flickered. But then, almost instantly, the wall went back up. He whispered, family stopped protecting me a long time ago. Now let me ask you, was that the voice of a traitor or a wounded son? Was Harry a calculating conspirator or a man so broken that betrayal felt like his only option? And stood her ground. She reminded him of his oath, of the duty that came with his birthright. She spoke of his grandmother, of the Queen's lifetime of service. Do you think she would recognize the man you've become? She demanded. Harry's answer was brutal. She'd understand why I had to do it. That cut and deeper than any evidence she had uncovered. To invoke the Queen's name, to twist her legacy into a justification for betrayal, it was unforgivable. But it also revealed something crucial. Harry truly believed he was the victim, not the aggressor. The conversation grew sharper. Voices rose. An accused. Harry defended. She spoke of loyalty. He spoke of survival. Each word widened the chasm between them, until it felt like they weren't family anymore, but adversaries locked in a battle neither wanted to lose. Here's where the contradictions become unbearable. Charles had spent his entire reign trying to steady the monarchy. He wanted to be a unifier, a healer, a modernizer. And yet, just as he finally settled into the role, he was faced with the most intimate betrayal possible. His crown, his family, his reputation, all at risk. Because of Camilla. And yet, even with all this, Charles hesitated. Evidence is one thing. Accusations are another. Could it really be true? Could the woman who stood beside him during his coronation be the same woman plotting behind his back? The thought was unthinkable, but the folder in front of him left no room for imagination. Now here's the twist. The investigation didn't just uncover evidence of jewels being sold. It uncovered something worse. Documents suggested this wasn't a one-time mistake, a single lapse in judgment. It was a pattern. Multiple pieces, multiple sales, over months, even years. And the deeper they dug, the more the evidence piled up. Camilla wasn't dabbling. She was running a pipeline. Think about that for a second. A queen consort, not just caught once, but repeatedly. Not just rumors, but records. Not just suspicion, but proof. And yet, here's the cruel irony. Even as Charles sat with the evidence, he couldn't go public. Not yet. Because if he exposed Camilla too soon, without the jewels recovered, without the buyers identified, it would destroy everything without fixing anything. The monarchy would look weak. The jewels would still be gone. And the story would spin out of control. So Charles did the only thing he could. He waited. He watched. And he planned. Meanwhile, Camilla carried on as though nothing had happened. Public appearances. Smiles. State dinners. Standing beside Charles, waving to the crowds. No one in the outside world could have guessed the storm brewing inside Buckingham Palace. But behind those walls, tension was suffocating. Every glance, every silence, every moment stretched taut with suspicion. And you have to wonder, did Camilla know? Did she realize Charles had the evidence? Did she suspect the walls were closing in? Or was she so confident, so sure of her place, that she believed no one would dare accuse her? That question remains unanswered. But one thing is certain. Charles was preparing for the inevitable. Because the day would come when whispers would no longer be enough. The day would come when the truth would explode into the public. And when it did, the monarchy would never be the same again. But here's the real question. How do you confront a queen consort? How do you strip your own wife of power, knowing the world is watching? Charles had made up his mind. He would act. But the way he chose to act? That's what shocked everyone. How do you confront a queen? How do you stand face to face with the person you've shared decades of your life with, knowing you're about to accuse them of betraying not just you, but the monarchy itself? This wasn't a conversation about hurt feelings or private arguments. This was a confrontation about history, about power, about the very survival of the crown. And for Charles, the stakes couldn't have been higher. The palace was silent the night he made his decision. A silence so heavy, you could almost hear it pressing against the walls. Staff moved cautiously, sensing the tension in the air. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. Charles sat alone in his private study, the folder of evidence spread out in front of him like an open wound. He had rehearsed the words in his mind 100 times. And still, when the moment came, he found himself asking, "How do you accuse your wife of treason?" He summoned her quietly. No grand gestures. No staff present. Just the two of them in a room that had seen countless monarchs before them. She walked in, calm, composed, wearing the expression of someone who had stood beside him through ceremonies, state dinners, and public storms. She didn't know this storm was different. Not yet. Charles didn't shout. He didn't rage. That wasn't his way. Instead, he laid out the papers one by one, his voice steady but trembling beneath the weight of betrayal. The photographs, the receipts, the transfers. Every page, another dagger. Every detail, another betrayal made real. And then came the question that would haunt the walls of Buckingham Palace for years to come. Why? Camilla froze. For the first time, her mask cracked. Her composure slipped. She reached for explanations, half-truths, deflections, fragments of denial. She claimed misunderstandings, misfiled records, trusted intermediaries who must have deceived her. But Charles wasn't buying it. He had the evidence. He had the truth. And no excuse could erase what he had seen with his own eyes. But here's the contradiction that makes this moment so unforgettable. Even as Charles confronted her, even as the evidence sat between them like a ticking bomb, part of him still wanted to believe her. He had spent decades defending her to the world. He had fought public opinion, faced down criticism, and endured the shadow of Diana's memory, all to stand by Camilla. And now, when he finally needed her loyalty, she had allegedly betrayed him. Ask yourself, what would you do in that moment? Would you walk away? Would you forgive? Or would you do what Charles did? Decide that the monarchy mattered more than marriage? The confrontation stretched into the early hours. Voices rose, sharp, cutting through the palace halls. Advisors pretended not to hear, but whispers traveled quickly. Staff knew something monumental was happening behind closed doors. And when Camilla finally stormed out of that study, her face pale and her eyes blazing with fury, the whispers turned into certainties. The queen consort was in trouble, but Charles wasn't finished. No, not yet, because confrontation was only the first step. The monarchy demanded more than private arguments. It demanded public action. He couldn't simply scold his wife and hope it would all disappear. The evidence was too damning, the stakes too high. He had to make a choice, one that would not only define his reign, but also the monarchy's future. And here's where the story takes a turn none of his ancestors could have prepared him for. Kings of the past dealt with betrayal through banishment, imprisonment, or even worse. But Charles lived in the modern age, under the scrutiny of cameras, headlines, and social media. He couldn't quietly make Camilla vanish. He had to act decisively, and he had to act publicly. So he began planning the unthinkable, stripping his own wife of her titles. Let that sink in for a moment. A king, not even 2 years into his reign, preparing to publicly humiliate the woman he once called the love of his life. Imagine the personal cost. Imagine the humiliation. Imagine the fury it would unleash inside the palace walls. And yet, Charles knew it was the only way to save the monarchy from collapse. Behind the scenes, preparations began. Legal teams drafted statements. Advisors debated wording. Should it be framed as a betrayal of the crown? A breach of trust? A matter of national security? Every word mattered. Every syllable would be dissected by historians, critics, and the public for years to come. Meanwhile, Camilla didn't retreat quietly. Oh no. She pushed back. She argued. She pleaded. She reminded Charles of their history, of everything they had endured together. She painted herself as a victim of misunderstanding, a casualty of overzealous investigators. She even suggested the evidence had been planted by enemies within the monarchy, people who never wanted her on the throne in the first place. And here's the cruel irony. She wasn't entirely wrong. For years, factions within the monarchy had resented her presence. They saw her as an intruder, a usurper, a stain on the memory of Diana. Was it possible someone had set her up? Was it possible the evidence was manipulated? The question lingered, not at the edges of Charles's mind, but the evidence was too detailed, too consistent. If it was a setup, it was flawless. So Charles pressed on. And as he did, the royal family began to fracture. William, fiercely protective of the monarchy, supported his father's decision. Kate, ever the symbol of dignity, stood firmly behind William. Harry, on the other hand, reportedly recoiled in disbelief. To him, it was yet another example of the monarchy devouring its own. The family dinners grew colder, the silences longer, the trust thinner, and through it all, the question remained: how would the public react? The monarchy survives not just on crowns and ceremonies, but on the consent of the people. If Charles stripped Camilla of her titles, would the public cheer? Or would they see it as a desperate act of a faltering king, turning on his own wife to save himself? The night before the announcement, Charles barely slept. Advisors urged him to stand strong. The monarchy couldn't survive another scandal swept under the rug. It had to be addressed. It had to be decisive. He looked out the window of Buckingham Palace, across the city of London, and wondered, would history see him as a savior, or a traitor to love itself? And so, with the decision made, preparations finalized, and the world blissfully unaware of the storm about to break, Charles steeled himself for the hardest announcement of his life. He would take the crown's most sacred weapon, its power to bestow and strip titles, and turn it against the woman he once fought so hard to legitimize. But here's the thing. Just as Charles prepared to make his move, just as Camilla braced herself for the humiliation of a lifetime, a new twist emerged. Evidence suggesting the jewels hadn't simply been sold for profit, but that they had ended up in places far more dangerous and far more scandalous than anyone in the palace had dared to imagine. What if the jewels weren't just sold for greed? What if they ended up somewhere darker, somewhere that could compromise not only the monarchy, but the very nation it represents? This is where the scandal twists into something far more sinister. Because when investigators dug deeper into the trail of missing jewels, they didn't just find private collectors or discreet billionaires. They found connections to figures and places that made the palace shudder. The first shocking discovery came from an auction house in Geneva. Not the kind that splashes its sales across glossy magazines, but the kind that thrives on secrecy. Invitations only. No public catalogs. Wealthy buyers gather behind closed doors to bid on items that should never see the light of day. Investigators found a sapphire brooch, nearly identical to one last worn by Queen Elizabeth, catalogued under Provenance, private estate. But when they traced its details, its cut, its age, its distinctive clasp, it was unmistakable. This wasn't just any brooch. This was the brooch. A piece that should have been locked in the Tower of London, now quietly changing hands for millions. Ask yourself, how does something like that happen? How does a jewel with centuries of history vanish from the crown collection and reappear on a secret auction block halfway across Europe? The answer pointed back to a chain of sales. Quiet transfers. Shadow brokers. Each one designed to cover the trail. And at the center of those transfers? Payments linked to accounts that circled dangerously close to Camilla's orbit. But Geneva was just the beginning. Because the trail didn't stop in Europe. It reached further. To Dubai. To Hong Kong. To private collections in Moscow. Each time investigators found a trace, they found more proof that these jewels weren't just disappearing into safes. They were becoming trophies. Symbols of power for men and women far outside Britain's borders. And here's where the contradiction grows unbearable. The very symbols of Britain's endurance, its pride, were now being flaunted by people with no loyalty to the crown. One account in particular rattled the palace. A diamond-studded tiara, once photographed on Princess Margaret during a state banquet, had allegedly been traced to the possession of a foreign oligarch. Someone with deep ties to corruption. Someone whose name carried enough scandal to fill entire headlines. Imagine the humiliation. British heritage reduced to a plaything, worn in private parties as though it were nothing more than a costume. And here's where things get darker still. Documents surfaced suggesting that not all sales were purely financial. Some jewels may have been traded, bartered, exchanged for influence. A favor here, a promise there. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about missing treasures. It was about politics, about leverage. If jewels ended up in the hands of individuals with interests hostile to Britain, what else was on the table? Could state secrets be compromised? Could Camilla, or whoever was orchestrating these exchanges, have placed the monarchy in a position of dangerous vulnerability? Think about it. Every jewel carries not only monetary value, but symbolic weight. To own one is to own a piece of British history. To parade it privately is to mock the monarchy. To use it as leverage? That's power at its most insidious. Now imagine Charles being briefed on this development. Already reeling from the betrayal of his wife. Already preparing for the humiliation of stripping her titles. And now told that the jewels weren't just gone. They were weaponized. They were circulating in places where Britain had enemies, where every diamond could be used as a bargaining chip. For Charles, this was more than personal. It was existential. The monarchy wasn't just embarrassed, it was compromised. And the question that haunted him was this. Was Camilla acting alone, or was she part of something bigger? Let me ask you, what do you think? Could one woman orchestrate such a network on her own? Or was there someone else behind the curtain, pulling the strings, using her as a pawn? Because as the investigation deepened, new names began to emerge. Associates, go-betweens, individuals with ties not just to jewel trading, but to intelligence circles. Suddenly, the scandal wasn't just about betrayal in marriage. It was about betrayal of country. And that's what made Charles's next step inevitable. He could no longer afford hesitation. To do nothing meant risking not only his crown, but national security. Every delay meant another jewel disappearing into the shadows, another piece of heritage lost forever. But here's the irony. Even as Charles prepared to go public, even as he steeled himself to strip Camilla of her titles, the palace was divided. Some advisors argued exposure would destroy the monarchy's credibility. Better to cover it up, handle it quietly, bury it in secrecy. After all, hadn't the monarchy survived centuries by keeping its darkest scandals hidden? Others insisted that transparency was the only way forward. That Charles had to stand strong, make an example, and prove the monarchy could not be corrupted, even from within. Charles faced the same dilemma monarchs had faced for centuries: protect the institution through silence, or protect it through truth. But whichever path he chose, one thing was certain: there would be no turning back. And while the king wrestled with this impossible choice, Camilla wasn't sitting idly by. Behind the scenes, she rallied her own allies, old friends, loyal courtiers, even sympathetic members of the press. She painted herself as the victim of a witch hunt. She claimed she was being scapegoated, targeted by enemies who never accepted her as queen. And to some extent, she wasn't wrong. The palace had always been divided over her. For decades, whispers followed her, branding her as the outsider, the usurper. Was this scandal simply confirmation bias, people finally finding the evidence they always wanted to believe existed? Or was she truly guilty? That's the question that made this scandal so electric. Because it wasn't just about facts. It was about perception. Half the palace saw her as a traitor. The other half saw her as a victim. And in the middle of it all, Charles knew the truth would break either way. So preparations continued for the announcement. Advisors polished the speech. Lawyers reviewed every phrase. Security was tightened around the palace. The world had no idea what was coming, but the insiders knew. A reckoning was about to explode. And yet, just as Charles prepared to step into history, another twist emerged. Evidence surfaced suggesting that one of the missing jewels, the infamous Cambridge emeralds, hadn't left Britain at all. It was still in the country, still circulating, still within reach. But the person holding it wasn't a stranger on foreign soil. It was someone shockingly close to the royal family itself. What if the betrayal wasn't just Camilla's? What if someone inside the royal family itself was holding on to one of the missing jewels, the Cambridge emeralds, like a ticking time bomb? Imagine the shock when investigators, already knee-deep in scandal, uncovered that one of the monarchy's most famous treasures hadn't left Britain's borders at all. No shadowy auction in Geneva. No billionaire in Dubai. No oligarch flaunting it in Moscow. It was still here, hidden in plain sight, in the hands of someone dangerously close to the crown. Now pause for a second and let that sink in. We're not just talking about a misplaced bracelet or a forgotten brooch. The Cambridge emeralds are legendary. Their history is woven into the monarchy itself, passed through generations, glittering on tiaras and necklaces worn at coronations and royal weddings. These stones aren't just valuable, they're iconic. And to discover one of them outside the vault, circulating secretly, was nothing less than explosive. So who had it? That's the question that sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. The trail led investigators to a private vault, not in London, but in a discreet countryside estate. A location tied not to jewel traders or foreign buyers, but to a name from within the royal circle. Someone who had long been part of the monarchy's inner orbit. At first, the investigators didn't believe it. How could a family member, someone with royal blood, risk such disgrace? But the evidence was undeniable. The emerald was there, wrapped in velvet, tucked away as though it were nothing more than a family heirloom, not a national treasure. This raised an even darker question. Was Camilla truly the mastermind, or was she just the lightning rod for a much bigger conspiracy? Could it be that other royals were quietly involved, each taking their piece, each covering their tracks? If so, then Charles wasn't facing just the betrayal of his wife. He was facing a betrayal that cut through the entire family tree. Think about the contradictions. On one hand, the monarchy projects unity, dignity, and duty. On the other, behind closed doors, the jewels meant to symbolize permanence were being siphoned off, hidden, and sold. The public saw crowns sparkling on balconies. The reality was jewels vanishing into safes. Doesn't that feel like the ultimate irony? But here's where things get personal. The name tied to the emerald wasn't some distant cousin or obscure duke. It was someone shockingly close. Someone whose relationship with Charles had always been complicated, fraught with rivalry, suspicion, and undercurrents of resentment. Imagine being Charles, already betrayed by his wife, now staring at evidence that suggested another betrayal, this time from a blood relative. The discovery of the Cambridge emerald shattered what little stability remained inside the palace. Advisors scrambled. Who else knew? Who else might be implicated? The walls that once protected the monarchy now echoed with mistrust. Every whispered conversation carried weight. Every locked door hinted at secrets. And here's where the emotional stakes went through the roof. Because if Charles went public with this, he wouldn't just be stripping Camilla of her titles. He'd be exposing fractures in his own family. He'd be admitting that the very people entrusted with Britain's heritage were the ones dismantling it piece by piece. Can you imagine the humiliation? The headlines? The global outrage? So Charles faced another impossible question. Protect the monarchy by protecting the guilty, or risk destroying it by telling the truth? Let me ask you, what would you do? Would you sacrifice your family to save the institution, or sacrifice the institution to save your family? Because either way, someone loses. The Cambridge Emerald scandal raised an even deeper issue. If one jewel was found in Britain, hidden by someone close to the throne, how many others were? How much of the so-called missing collection was not in foreign hands, but stashed in secret vaults, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? And here's a chilling thought. What if these jewels weren't stolen for money at all? What if they were being kept as leverage? Imagine a royal relative holding onto a priceless gem, knowing that at any moment, they could expose its presence and plunge the monarchy into chaos. That's not theft. That's power. That's control. Charles's advisors urged caution. They reminded him of history. Monarchies aren't destroyed by wars or revolutions alone. They're destroyed from within by betrayal and mistrust. If he exposed this now, the monarchy could unravel in real time. But if he stayed silent, the cancer would spread, rotting the institution from the inside out. So Charles did what monarchs have always done. He stalled. He bought himself time. Behind the scenes, he ordered quiet inquiries, discreet conversations, subtle pressure applied to those closest to the emerald. And yet, the more he pushed, the more resistance he faced, as if someone inside the palace was daring him to go public, daring him to reveal just how deep the rot went. And this is where the story takes its sharpest twist. Because just as Charles weighed his options, preparing to make the hardest decision of his reign, new whispers emerged. Whispers that the Cambridge Emerald wasn't the only piece tied to the royal family, that there were more jewels, more secrets, more betrayals, and the name linked to those whispers? A royal no one expected, someone who had always seemed loyal, someone whose betrayal would cut deeper than anything Charles had faced so far. The question wasn't just about jewels anymore. It was about survival. Could the monarchy withstand another revelation? Could Charles withstand another betrayal? What happens when the person you least expect becomes the one holding the knife? What happens when loyalty turns out to be the most dangerous mask of all? That was the reality Charles faced when the whispers around the Cambridge Emeralds uncovered not just Camilla's alleged betrayal, but the shocking involvement of another royal, one the world thought could never be touched by scandal. At first, the name seemed absurd, impossible. This was someone who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Charles at countless ceremonies. Someone who, in the public eye, embodied loyalty, service, and duty. And yet, investigators had traced more than one missing jewel to this person's orbit. Not just hidden away for safekeeping, but allegedly used as bargaining chips, exchanged quietly in private deals that never reached the light of day. Now pause and imagine the devastation. Charles was already reeling from Camilla's betrayal. His marriage, his trust, his reign, everything hanging by a thread. And now this. Another dagger, this time from within his own bloodline. The monarchy wasn't just cracking. It was collapsing under the weight of secrets. So who was it? That's the question that rattled through Buckingham Palace. The public didn't know yet. But behind closed doors, the name was whispered with a mix of fear and disbelief. Some courtiers refused to believe it. Others nodded knowingly, as if they had suspected all along. Here's the contradiction that makes this story so haunting. The very people who wore crowns, who draped themselves in ermine and diamonds, were also the ones dismantling the crown's treasures piece by piece. They smiled for the cameras by day, then hid jewels by night. Doesn't that make you wonder, how much of what we see from the monarchy is real, and how much is illusion? The deeper investigators dug, the more the trail revealed. It wasn't just the Cambridge Emerald. It was tiaras, brooches, necklaces. Pieces with histories tied to coronations and state dinners, now quietly tucked away in vaults or circulating through shadowy middlemen. Some of the transactions dated back years, which begged the question, how long had this been going on? Was Camilla just the tip of the iceberg? And here's where the emotional weight comes crashing in. Because Charles wasn't just king. He was a son, a brother, a father, a husband. Every role demanded loyalty. Every role required trust. And yet, betrayal was coming at him from all sides. What do you do when the people closest to you, the ones meant to protect you, are the ones dismantling everything you stand for? Imagine the loneliness of that moment. Charles in his private quarters, surrounded by documents, evidence, names. No one to turn to, no one to trust. Even his closest advisors were tainted by suspicion. He couldn't share the full truth with the public. He couldn't confide in his family. The crown was heavy, but now it was poisoned. And let's not forget the public angle. While all this chaos unfolded behind palace walls, the world outside still saw pomp and ceremony. Smiling royals, glittering crowns, grand parades, the illusion of stability. But underneath, the monarchy was rotting. And if the truth ever spilled out, the backlash would be catastrophic. Could the monarchy survive if the people discovered that the jewels, the very heart of their heritage, had been stolen by the royals themselves? Now here's the irony. The more evidence surfaced, the more some insiders began to argue that Charles couldn't go through with stripping Camilla's titles. Why? Because if he did, the focus would shift entirely to the other royal. Camilla, they argued, could be thrown under the bus. But exposing blood family? That would tear the monarchy apart. In other words, Camilla's disgrace might have been necessary to shield someone else even more powerful. Think about that for a second. Was Camilla a mastermind or a scapegoat? Was she the central figure in the scandal, or was she the convenient distraction while others kept their hands clean? That question is what made this scandal so deadly. Because if she was a scapegoat, then the real betrayal wasn't just personal, it was orchestrated. And here's where Charles faced yet another impossible choice. Expose everything and risk the monarchy's total collapse. Or sacrifice Camilla, strip her titles, and let the deeper betrayals remain hidden forever. Either path meant pain. Either path meant history would judge him harshly. So what would you have done? Would you burn it all down in the name of truth, or protect the institution by allowing one person to carry the weight of blame? Remember, Charles wasn't just deciding for himself. He was deciding for the monarchy, for Britain, for history. Every move he made would echo for centuries. But before Charles could make his final decision, before he could announce to the world what he intended to do, the scandal took one more shocking turn. Evidence surfaced that one of the missing jewels had already been promised to a buyer tied not just to wealth, but to politics. And not British politics. Foreign politics. That meant this wasn't just a scandal of betrayal. It was a scandal of national security. A scandal that could drag the monarchy into international humiliation. And when Charles heard that news, he realized he wasn't just fighting for the crown anymore. He was fighting for the survival of Britain's global reputation. But who was the foreign buyer? And what did they plan to do with a jewel that carried centuries of British history? The answer would send shivers through every corridor of Buckingham Palace.